to our inaugural Under the Hood concert. My name is Aimée Tsuchiya. I play piano, and I'm joined by my illustrious fellow faculty, Kyoko Hida on oboe, Teresa Myers on bassoon, Glenn Dickson on clarinet, and our guest artist today is Sarah Sutherland on horn. Today's presentation will be Beethoven's Quintet for Piano and Winds. This is one of, I would say, the genre's masterworks, certainly one of the most performed pieces for this instrumentation. In fact, the piece that it was modeled after was written by Mozart just a few years prior, and we think that Beethoven probably heard the piece and wrote basically the same kind of piece the very same year that he heard it in 1796. Mozart was the first to write this one, and after Beethoven wrote his, there really wasn't another quintet for piano and winds for a long time. There are a couple from obscure composers around the same era, but really not until maybe 60 years later, and even then, the composers that started to write quintets for the same instrumentation were people like Anton Rubinstein and Rimsky-Korsakov, both of whom used flute instead of oboe, sorry. There was also Elliott Carter, who wrote one not until 1991. There were actually quintets that started to appear for just winds. So rather than piano, you would have this battery of instruments plus flute. And a lot of those came out around the time of Beethoven and thereafter. Also, a lot of quintets for piano and strings, a lot more actually, probably by composers whose names you would recognize. People like Schubert, Borodin, Brahms, Dvorak, Bruch, Franck, Sibelius, Fauré, Shostakovich, Elgar, Schumann. Interestingly, not by Beethoven or Mozart. So why is this? Why do we have so few representatives of this instrumentation? One can speculate, one possibility is that the string family was just more of a unified sound. As you probably know, violin, viola, cello, bass, well, not bass, it would be two violins usually, occasionally a bass instead. All from the same family, all very similar in timbre. And perhaps more people were amateurs in the sense that they could play this music in their own home if they chose to. The wind instruments that you're going to hear today, obviously very different in sound and timbre. We have two double reed instruments, one single reed and one brass. And those instruments themselves were probably not as developed by the time Beethoven and Mozart were writing these works. The string instruments were basically pretty much what they are today by the 1700s, late 1700s, whereas the wind instruments would continue to evolve. And I'm going to hand it over to my colleagues for a second to talk about their instruments and how that might have been the case. Anyone of you want to go first?
I'll go first. Here's the explanation of the wind writing for almost all of us, really. This is a clarinet from the 1830s, a British English clarinet. But this is what Beethoven is writing for. It only has 5 keys on it. And in 1796, when he wrote this, there was probably 6-key clarinets around, but probably a lot of these around because these were used well into the 1800s. So it's a very obviously the result of not having many keys is you can't play in a lot of different keys. It's more like a recorder where you're limited to playing in C and F and G and not too many sharps or flats. So clarinet evolved during this time. You would have a C clarinet for playing in certain keys, and you'd have an A clarinet for playing in the sharp keys, and you'd have a B flat clarinet for playing in the flat keys. So, so this was written for a clarinet like this, and it was written for a B flat clarinet. This is a C clarinet. I don't have a B flat clarinet that looks like this. So all the holes are open. If you look at a modern clarinet, there's metal on all the little rings on all the keys to help with the intonation and the sound, and to play all the chromatic key notes. You have all these extra keys which are missing from this, so you can't play really an in-tune chromatic scale on this clarinet. And the other thing about it is the bore is a lot smaller than a modern clarinet, so the sound is not as big. And this goes for actually all of the woodwind instruments. The oboes at the same time probably looked very similar to this, not many keys. The bassoon probably had very few keys at that point too. So, so that dictates the style that he wrote for. Although Mozart had written a clarinet concerto a few years ago, it was for a very particular person, Johann Stadler, who was a virtuoso and had managed to make one of these things play a lot of notes fast. But your average player, which Beethoven was writing for, wasn't that facile. So if you look at the parts in this piece, the woodwind parts, they're not that crazy. They're pretty straight ahead and not a lot of notes in them. So you'll notice that all the virtuosic playing is relegated to the piano on this piece. So I'm just going to play this and just play similar notes on the other clarinet so you can sort of hear the contrast. Hopefully this reed that I made last night for this, it has a very different reed, will work. So here's the opening thing. Please forgive me. So it doesn't have as big a sound, and that would go for probably all the instruments also at that point. They weren't as big, even the piano didn't have as big a sound in that era. So it's probably a softer ensemble. That same thing on the modern clarinet. Whoa, I'm playing. So it's a lot bigger sound. So that's the main thing I have to say about this and the clarinet. It sort of introduces you to all the instruments. Does anybody have anything particular to say about their instruments and the music? No? Oh, the horn.
It doesn't really apply to me.
It doesn't
as
apply
much.
to hers.
If you guys, I can introduce the horn. So, about that time, the horn was still very underdeveloped. It didn't have any of this middle kind of stuff going on. So it was really just more of the outer stuff. And so there was a lot less tubing. It wasn't as heavy. That means that it wasn't as heavy. And also, like the clarinet, how there were clarinets for different keys, we had the same idea. But instead of getting a whole new horn, we would take out slides. They were called crooks. And we would put in different length ones, and it would put the horn into a different key. So there were no buttons, so we could only really play the notes that you can access by, just moving your face. Of course, then they started to learn that you could alter it with your hand, too. So if you take your hand out and go completely in, so then by that we can get some of them in between. So now, between that we couldn't get all of them to sound quite as rich, but eventually people figured it out. And then we figured out how to get them all, and we got our horn as we are today. It's a lot better, we only have to have one. Well, less stuff to carry.
Well, Glenn said most, but I think the oboe, we have to tune in the orchestra. The oboe is the tuning person. I think came from because we are so out of tune back then. I'm sure, we still have a lot of problems and are still keeping the tradition. We are playing the A in the orchestra.
Kyoko's the class clown in this group.
Okay, well, yeah. Okay, I'll give you A. You have to tune to music.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, the piano, as Glenn mentioned, was also smaller, although growing. By the time that Beethoven was writing, it was even a little larger in terms of the number of octaves and the size of the instrument than when Mozart was writing his. And you can kind of tell that the trend was generally to grow in terms of the size of instruments, but also the size of pieces and the technique that was involved in playing. So we feel like maybe if Beethoven modeled his quintet after Mozart's, he was a little competitive in how he did it. The pieces, if you compare them side by side, are about the same length. They're both about 25 minutes long. And if you even bother to like count measures and things or time the movements, they're all roughly the same, except for the first movement. Beethoven's first movement is actually twice as long. It is, in fact, the length of the second and third movements combined. And everything that Beethoven did was just slightly bigger or slightly grander or slightly more impressive than what we had in Mozart. Not to knock Mozart's piece, is fabulous, but just to kind of give you a taste. Mozart, in the opening of his quintet, would have a lot more call and response between the piano and the other instruments. You'd have a phrase started by the piano, let's say, and finished by the wind battery, or vice versa. Beethoven was like, no, I'm going to state the entire theme first, and then I'll let those guys say it next while I'm doing some other stuff in between. So we're going to play the opening of the first movement, Allegro, just to kind of give you a sense of how Beethoven's mind was working with this. Did you want it to move like that? He was also, they both sort of liked, it's kind of surprising us, a lot of composers had some humor or some sense that they had to kind of keep the audience on their toes. So this theme, when it comes back later in the first movement, that's called the Recapitulation, Mozart and Beethoven both approached it as a surprise. In other words, there was this big build-up, and then all of a sudden the sound would drop back, and we have this very sweet opening theme again. But Beethoven decided to one-up Mozart one more time by doing it even a little bit more extremely. So we're going to play for you the recapitulation area in the first movement, so you can hear how Beethoven wanted you to be surprised by the recapitulation. Also, Beethoven, interestingly enough, wrote a couple of cadenzas for this piece. So cadenzas are normally reserved for when you have a soloist, usually in a concerto setting when you have a soloist with orchestra, possibly a solo sonata, and where the person performing would want to take a second and just show you what they could do at the instrument. That's what cadenzas were basically for, was to show off technique and also to show off improvisatory skills. A lot of these pieces were performed by the composers themselves, and certainly this is the case with Beethoven at this time. When he wrote this piece, he was relatively new to the Viennese music scene, which was sort of the big venue for musicians at the time. And in order to make a name for himself, he really marketed himself as a fabulous virtuosic pianist. And that's often how he got his music heard, was by writing for himself, sometimes with other people, but sometimes solo. So Beethoven decided he would actually have cadenzas in his chamber music. And there are two of them. There's one in the first movement. There's also one in the third movement. And there's a really funny story, actually, about the cadenza in the third movement. Let's actually play it first. Let's go to our third movement cadenza, just so you can hear how it's going to lead up to that spot. the point of the cadenza. And the really funny story about this particular piece, that particular moment, was apparently one of the performances, perhaps even the first, he was playing with a variety of actually quite well-known musicians, including a very famous oboist named Brahms. And Beethoven's pupil was sitting in the audience listening to this performance, and at this moment, Beethoven decided to really just let it out. He did a very, very long cadenza here, improvised ad nauseum almost, to the point where the other instrumentalists never knew when to come back in. They kept kind of putting their instruments back up, waiting, and then not quite there, and it really annoyed the oboist, in fact. But everybody else in the audience thought it was fantastic, so when we get to that spot, you can see if you're amused or not. Also, in general, the technique you'll hear, as Glenn mentioned for the piano, is really quite flashy. There are moments where it seems like there's an awful lot going on in the piano part, maybe for no good reason other than just to show off. So let's play another spot in the third movement. And you can kind of hear it. The theme will actually be passed around in the wind section, but there's an awful lot in the piano section underneath, just to sort of keep things interesting. The virtuosos of the time were people like Hummel, people who performed amazingly at the keyboard, but of a sort of much more gallant, kind of polite almost style. It was very charming. Beethoven was a lot more sort of gruff. In Maynard Solomon's biography of Beethoven, which by the way I highly recommend reading, it's very readable and very interesting, he says, from all accounts, Beethoven was a remarkable pianist. His historic importance is that he bridged the classic and emergent romantic styles of performance. His powerful, brilliant, and imaginative style contrasted strongly with the fashionably sweet and delicate style of earlier keyboard virtuosos. Musicians who were attached to the earlier style apparently found Beethoven's playing harsh and disturbing. But most musicians and connoisseurs, especially those of the younger generation, were profoundly moved. It's like those kids in their rock and roll. And Brahms himself would later describe Beethoven's style as, quote, the beautiful and noble pathos, sublime in its feeling and imagination, the intensity perhaps violent in its expression. And to give you a little bit of this, as you will hear in the rest of the piece, we're going to play another excerpt from the very first movement. And then finally, we haven't touched on the second movement yet. The second movement is this sort of rondo style almost, in the sense that there's this main theme in the opening that keeps coming back throughout the movement, once again stated in the piano first. And what's interesting is that Beethoven, again, who is renowned for his improvisatory skills, would restate this theme in a way that was almost a variation, you could say, each time, and gave a sense of him just maybe improvising each time he would play it. So I'm going to play a little bit of the opening of the theme, and then I'll play when it comes back restated. here how much more decorated. And it will return again in a slightly new guise again. Before we perform this entire piece for you, I just wanted to quote something that I read by a musician named Tim Rainish, who I'm sure you're all not familiar with. He's a hornist, he's a wind ensemble conductor, and a professor at the Guildhall School of Music in London. And he presented a lecture a few years back at Beethoven Fest at the Royal Northern College of Music. And I thought this was a very interesting quote. He says, "I must profess I do not have much affection for Beethoven, partially because his horn parts are so difficult, and he's also extremely difficult to conduct. I do not have the love for him that I have for the wit of Haydn, or for the tragic lyricism of Schubert, or for the all-encompassing Mozart, whose music for me runs the gamut of emotion. The first scores in my library are the collected works of Mozart in the new edition, ready for my desert island." You know, like what would you bring to a desert island if you were stranded there? "And while I might add in symphonies and quartets by Haydn and songs and chamber music of Schubert, I don't think I would pack any Beethoven. I really am too scared. My big problem is that when listening to, and especially when conducting Beethoven, I have this very strong feeling that he is probably the giant of composers, the titan of the quartet, the god of the symphony. Can any other composer approach that extraordinary energy of the fast movements, or the serenity of the slow, or his use of quite unpromising material as the basis for superb developments and expansions? Certainly he is the one composer whose music I feel I must attempt with all my being to get everything right. Speeds, phrasing, balance, articulation, sound world. I must try to get as near his scores as I can. There is no room for interpretation or for changing the text. So we will try our best today to get the Beethoven exactly right. And we hope you enjoy our performance.
Thank you.